to risk management, again, this is another important aspect of project management is to manage the risks. Now the question is, what are risks? What do you think about it? What are risks? Any answer? What do you think? What are risks? Who can give me some basic ideas? What do you think is a risk?
Maybe if it's a new technology.
Yeah. So what is? Yeah, I see. It's a new technology. So what is the risk itself?
It's a percentage for failure.
Percentage for failure. Okay. Yes. Anyone else who wants to add to it? Any example of risk or anything, any definition of risk or any understanding regarding risk? What are risks?
It's something that has a wanted reward, but running the risk of a high failure percentage.
Yeah, which is almost okay, but the thing is you define risk with risk. So your statement includes risk, right? So yeah, that's okay. But let's think about this. Let's think about risk is something about possibility of something going wrong. Does this make sense? Risk is possibility of something going wrong in a very general terms, right? In general terms. So possibility of something going wrong. If something went wrong, is it a risk?
It's failure.
It's already done, right? So it's not a risk.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, yeah, you're right. So we are speaking about risk is something which we fear can go wrong, the possibility of something going wrong, not something which have already gone wrong. That's not a risk, right? So what could be some examples of risk in a software project? Think about it, or even think about your own project. What are some of the risks? Of course, your project is coming towards the end, so it's not much to think about. But I'm assuming you are in the beginning of the project. What do you think could be some examples of risks in your project? Let me start with one of the risk is that we don't have enough technical knowledge to carry out the project. So lack of enough technical knowledge for the project. What else do you think?
We don't have time to implement every single function.
Yeah. So one of the risk of the project is that the project there's a possibility of project getting delayed or not having enough time to complete the project. So that's another possibility of something going wrong, right? Another possibility of risk could be your team members might not cooperate with each other. Again, it could be a risk, low risk, high risk, different thing, but it's still a possibility, right? A possibility that a team member drops the course is a risk, because if he drops the course, then you lose him in your team. So you see what are the examples of the risk we are speaking about? So these are all possibilities of something going wrong. If someone did drop, in fact, the course, then that's not a risk. No, it's a fact, and we have to deal with it. So this is something important now. So yeah, risks are always there, right? And risks, if there are there, we have to deal with them. So one of the things what we do in the project management is also once we start the project, we need to see how we are going to do with risk management. And to understand how we do risk management, we have to understand that risk management broadly has following steps. So risk management has following important steps. One of them is called risk identification. The another one is risk analysis. Okay. And the third one is risk planning. And the last is risk monitoring. Okay. So let's try to understand these concepts. Okay. So what we have to do in risk management is, of course, we can't manage risk unless we have identified what are the important risks for my project. And then once we have identified the list of risks, we have to do analysis. We have to do planning about them, and then we have to do monitoring. So let's take it one by one. So let's take the first one first. So risk identification. What do we mean by risk identification? By risk identification, we mean that we need to brainstorm and look at the situation to identify the list of possible things which can go wrong, as we just spoke about, right? A number of things which can go wrong. And these possibilities of risks, some of the risks are common risk across many projects. Some of them are specific to the type of projects. So assuming that you have a project where you have a module of the project to be developed by a project team who is going to work from another country, do you think some specific risks because of that? Let me know. If you have some module to be developed from by a project team working in another country, what could be a risk? Or maybe integrating a module developed by other, which has to be developed by the company. Yeah, so they are in different time zones. Yeah, we understand that different countries are in different time zones. So, but what is the risk there? Yeah, that's the fact that we are in different time zones, most likely. But what is the risk because of that? What is the risk because our team is working from other location, different country?
Maybe because they are in a different location, we will have miscommunication.
Yeah, so the risk of miscommunication, the risk of delay because of miscommunication and related aspects, right? This could be one possible risk. The risk, assuming this team is not only in a different country, it's a different language or stuff like that. So you might have other sort of risk, right? That how you're going to collaborate as team. So you might have specific risk. What if a project needs some members of the team to get some training in a different country? So part of this project, you're going to send your team members to a different country to get some training, which is needed for the project development. What could be some of the risk? The risk could be that, okay, maybe my members will not, they have to go, let's assume they are going to go for 4 months for training. The possibility that the members will not acclimatize themselves with the new environment. They may not get comfortable with the new environment, and they are not able to take the benefit from the training. This could be one possible risk, right? The possibility that the members are not going to settle or get comfortable in the new environment. So what I'm saying is, depending on the project specifics, you might have specific risk. And there are some general risks: risk of delay of the project, risk of product qualities, risk of budget. There could be some general risk happening. And of course, that also might have specific indicators for different projects, but generally, yeah, but then there are specific project related risk, and you have to identify them, right? So risk of an employee getting sick, risk of my people leaving company, staff turnover. Maybe many employees might leave my company and join other companies or join competitors or stuff like that. So there are many, many different types of risks. We need to identify this. So this is the first thing. So what is the result of risk identification? The result is a list of risks. And of course, there can be some very far-fetched risks. Risk of a fire happening and destroying our office space. Risk of an earthquake. Risk of some virus spreading, right? So it could be many different possibilities of risk, right? So the thing is, so yeah, you need to identify risks. Some of the risk would be very apparent in a given project, right? So as a team, you know, okay, we know that this technology we are committing for the project, we don't have good experience. So the risk is that we might not be able to deliver this because we don't have this experience in the technology. So some of the risks could be obvious. But some of the risk, you have to use indicators to identify them. So there's another idea that indicators to identify risk. Just as an example, let's say I identified a risk that many people might leave the company. So this is a risk that I might lose my important employees. Now, maybe this is not going to be on the face, you will not get it. But there might be indicators to think about it. What do you think are some of the indicators of this type of particular risk? What is indicating this risk? Any idea? So what's the indicator of the risk of staff turnover? Staff, important employees leaving the company. Indicator could be, example of that, could be that there are many good job opportunities in the market. So you have this feeling that maybe many people might get a better opportunity and leave. This is one indicator. Another indicator could be, any idea?
Lack of interest from the workers.
Yeah, so you're seeing that maybe the staff motivation and morale is down for some reason, right? So they don't seem that motivated. Maybe there are some internal issues going on. So you know, yeah, people are asking for raise, so they're not satisfied. Somehow their motivation is down. So these could be indicators of risk. Or maybe you saw that part of the teams in the previous project, they were not getting along very well. There were some issues between the team member. So there can be indicators which can tell you these type of problems might happen. So what is the whole point of this is, of course, risk identification. We have to list down the possible risks happening. But then some of this risk might be obvious, but some of them might be indirect. You might have some pointers, some indicators. Based on that, you're going to identify those risks. Make sense? Now we come to the next part. After we have identified the risk, we might have a list of risks. And again, it could be a session, it could be multiple sessions of brainstorming and stuff like that. And people from different groups might participate. People, of course, from project management, from technical team leaderships, higher management, you might sit together, do some identification process. But then once we have identified the risks, this another important step we have to go now is what we call risk analysis. Okay. Now, what do we mean by risk analysis? Risk analysis involves two major things, right? One of them can be called as the possibility or probability of that risk happening. So you are assessing what is the likelihood, what is the chance that this risk is going to happen, as a probability, as a possibility, whatever, high, medium, low, 0.8, 0.7, it could be anything. Of course, high, medium, low might make much sense in the beginning. So you are going to assess the possibility or the probability of that risk happening. And then there's another important thing is the consequence of the risk. Okay, so these are the two important things you have to do for risk analysis. You want to see the possibility of that risk happening, and if that risks happen, right, what are the consequences? What are the results of that? Is this making sense? So possibility of risk and consequence. For example, let's say you have here risk. So here you have risk number 1, you have risk number 2, you have risk number 3, and so forth. You have identified a number of risks. So what do you do in risk analysis, in a sense, is you're coming with this type of table. You're going to say here, probability of risk, consequence of the risk, right? So what might happen is you may say, okay, what is the possibility that risk may happen? You'll say, okay, the possibility of this is happening is going to be high. So probability could be, again, numbers, or it could be high, medium, low. The consequence is the effect. If that risk in fact becomes a reality, it happens, then what is the effect of that risk, right? And the effect of the risk, the consequence of the risk, in broadly speaking, can have three different consequences. It can have a consequence on the project. It can have consequence on the project and the product, and consequence on the organization, the company itself. So what could be consequences, right? The consequences again could be some scale. So you can say that these are minimal consequences, these have serious consequences, these are catastrophic, very high consequences. So again, it could be a scale of high, medium, low, or serious, not serious, or mild, or moderate. So you can have different scales, right? So this is something also we have to keep in mind. So, and again, it could be a scale of 1, 2, 3, or it could be different numbers, right? So you can think about it. So one possibility is you'll say, okay, this possibility is high, but its consequence is insignificant. Or this is catastrophic, right? Or this is serious. You see what is the difference between probability of risk and consequence of risk. So a probability of risk is how likely that risk is going to become a reality. The consequence is if it becomes a reality, what is the effect of the risk on the project, on the product, and organization? Some risks affect only the project. Some risks can affect only the product. Some risk can affect the organization. And most of the cases, a given risk affects more than one thing. So a project risk can lead to some issues in the product. And of course, if you have issues in the product, it might have consequences for the organization. So things might be related most of the time, right? So can you give an example of a risk and think about its probability and consequence? So for example, that we have a risk that a member of my team might drop the course. Okay, so you might say in the beginning of the course, what's the possibility of a member dropping a course? Maybe the possibility is low. Why? Because you again, it's not just you just make a very blind guess. There are some reasons to believe that. So you'll think about it. Okay, what's the possibility of a student dropping a course? You start thinking about the history. How many students generally drop a course? And you might find that let's say if you have 100 students at an average, only 1 or 2 students drop a course. So the percentage, the probability is less than 5% that a student drops a course. Another reason to believe that the possibility, the probability of that risk happening is low is that this course is a core course and it's an important course for you to take other courses in the future semester. So it's not, even if the student tends to feel that he should drop, many a times students don't drop this course, right? So, but and this might depend on from course to course. So that's the point. So you will assess the possibility of a student. If it's a course, is an elective course, the possibility of student dropping the course is higher than a core course. Make sense? And again, it also depends on many other circumstances. Maybe he's graduating and this elective course is the last course in the semester. So maybe he will not drop. It's very less chance that he's going to drop. So again, look, assessing the situation, you're going to decide whether this is high, medium, low possibility. But what is the, so we said, okay, a member dropping the course, the possibility or the probability is low. But what is the consequence for the team if he in fact drops the course? Maybe the consequence is going to be serious because you have 4 or 5 members team, and if one of the member drops, you feel that you're going to have serious consequences. Is this idea clear? What's the difference between the possibility of the risk and the consequence of the risk? Yes, no?
Yes.
Makes sense, right? So this is the whole idea of risk analysis. So you come up with this type of thing, the possibility of risk and the consequence of risk. So naturally, some of the risk will be, for example, high and catastrophic. Some risk will be high, but for example, moderate. Some might be high and insignificant and stuff like that. Similarly, some might be medium. So you have all these possible combinations happening, right? And similarly, for example, low, all these possibilities happening. So you come up with this, and this is what is the main thing you do in risk analysis. Good. Now we go to the next part, which is what we call risk planning. How do we plan for those risks? Now, what do we mean by planning for the risk? There are three major things. We have one aspect is called risk avoidance. Another thing is called risk mitigation. And you have something called risk avoidance, risk mitigation, and you have something called contingency plan. These are the three aspects of risk planning. So once you have a list of risk and you have done the analysis on the risk, naturally the best thing is you want to take steps so that you can avoid the risk. Means that risk is no longer a risk, right or no? Makes sense. So we want to avoid the risk completely. So this is one thing, but we know that it's not possible every time to avoid the risk completely, right? So for example, there's a risk that my server might fail. And because there's a risk that a server might fail, I have a planning to say that, okay, I'm going to have 2 backup servers, not even 1. So almost I'm going to avoid the risk. This risk is not going to happen, because now I'm not speaking about just having 1 backup. I am having 2 backups. So the probability of all 3 failing is for practical reasons almost very insignificant. So we might say, okay, doing this step, we can avoid the risk. So this is part of the planning. So you decide to buy 2 backup servers. But we know that not every time we might be able to avoid the risk completely, either because it's beyond our control to avoid, or sometimes we understand that avoiding the steps we take to avoid cost us something, right? It's not free. So we might not, even if it says that, yeah, if you take 3 backup servers, you're completely going to avoid it, but I can't afford to have 3 backup servers. I can have maximum of 1 backup server. So the next thing is, if you cannot avoid the risk completely, of course, you have to have some sort of planning to mitigate the risk. And mitigating the risk means basically to make its possibility going low or its consequences going low. So if it was a high risk, you're going to do some planning so that that high risk becomes now a sort of medium risk or low risk. You are not avoiding it completely, but you are mitigating the risk, or you are mitigating its effect. So it was catastrophic, but you, based on some planning you did, now it became moderate. The consequence becomes moderate, or it was moderate, now it becomes insignificant. So that's the idea of risk mitigation. The third thing, which is part of risk planning, is the idea of contingency planning. So the contingency planning is the idea that, okay, if the risk eventually becomes a reality, what are you going to do? What's your plan B? What's your plan C? So what is in place? So this is called the contingency plan. So you have to also come up with some contingency plan. What if the staffs leave my company? What I'm going to do? Maybe I'm going to do the contingency plan is to have some outsourcing. So I already initiate some discussions with other companies to get myself ready that in case the employees leave and I cannot get good employees at time, I may offshore, right? Or I may outsource some part of the project. So this is part of the contingency planning, right? What you'll do if that happens. Okay, I have an important modeling team member and I know he's not happy with the company for some reasons and he's going to leave. So of course, the avoidance strategy is to deal with this and speak to him, for example, see what is making him not motivated or what's making him not satisfied with the company. Try to deal with this so that that problem is gone. Maybe he's not happy with the salary, right? He believes that he's not paid enough or he's not paid fairly. So risk avoidance would be, yeah, we discuss with him and we see what makes it reasonable, and we take steps so that we can resolve it. We pay him the right salary, and in that case the risk is avoided completely. But maybe he has other reasons. He has some family reasons. He have reasons. He's somehow not happy working with some other members, and some of them we cannot actually resolve it. We cannot avoid it. So we try to mitigate it. Maybe if these 2 members are not going to go well together, maybe let's look at possibility that they are part of the project, but they are working not closely with each other. So we mitigate it. We don't completely avoid it. or maybe he has some issues with the family issues or health issues. Let's try to deal with, maybe advise him to take some breaks in between, seek advice, medical advice, whatever, or other help. But maybe it's not going to avoid it completely, but mitigate it. But the point is, yeah, eventually if he left the company, what I'm going to do? So maybe I have a backup employee. I'm going to give him some training in the meantime, so that if that main experienced employee eventually leaves, my contingency plan says that this backup employee, he was getting trained on that technology, he takes over. So that's the idea of contingency planning. So these are the three major aspects of planning: risk avoidance, risk mitigation, and contingency planning. Anyone who's not clear with these ideas, let me know. Anyone of you who's not clear with the idea of this risk planning? Okay, so in that case, let's move forward then. So one of the another thing is the last, okay, yeah, before even going to risk monitoring, we have to keep something very important in mind. Now, risk planning, do you believe that generally speaking, it takes a lot of time because you have to come up with your plan of risk avoidance, risk mitigation, contingency. So it takes time. So no doubt, risk planning takes time. And also many a times, takes resources and money, so it costs you something, right? So risk planning is not free, so to say. So keeping this in mind, that risk planning takes time, and it takes some resources, and it costs you something. So the point here is, once you have identified a list of risks, you might identify maybe 100 risks, maybe 200 risks in a given project. It could be any number of risks, right? You're going to do the analysis and you're going to do the planning. Now the question would be, would you plan for each and every risk you have identified and analyzed? Will this make sense?
No, maybe for the higher one, higher priority ones.
Why we are not going to do the planning for each and every risk? We just spoke about it because it takes time, it takes resources and money. It's costly, right? So we can't afford to do everything to deal with every risk. So what we are going to do is basically we are going to select a subset of risks from after risk analysis to do this type of planning. Now, what are the subset of risks which we have to ideally plan for? What would be your obvious answer? That those risks which are having higher possibilities, relatively speaking, and higher consequences, right? So if you have a risk which is low possibility and its consequence is very low, right? So for example, I say that the possibility of this risk is happening is 5%. And the consequence of this risk is very minor consequences, insignificant consequence. Are you going to do planning for this risk? What do you think?
Actually, no.
No, right? Because the planning of that risk might take a lot of time and money, and it's not really worth it. Because first of all, you know that it's happening, is becoming a reality is very low. And even if it becomes, its consequence is not big. So why should you really plan for it? Think about this one now. There's a risk, of course, the opposite extreme is that it's very high possibility. The risk happening is very high, or it's a percentage like 80%, 90%. And the consequence is serious. Of course, you're going to plan for it, right? Because this is makes a lot of sense, right? Similarly, you might have something like high risk and the consequence could be moderate. This might also be a relatively good candidate to think about. Or maybe, for example, a risk which is medium, its possibility of happening is medium, but its consequences are serious or catastrophic. Of course, this might also be some candidates. So you have to assess that based on your list. What are the list or subset of the list you're going to select for planning? For example, there is a risk which is catastrophic, very serious risk, the consequence, but its possibility of having is less than 1%. Maybe you're not going to plan for it. So one of the risks is that earthquake will happen and is going to destroy my company building. Of course, if that happens, the consequence is going to be very serious. But what is the possibility of that happening? Maybe very, very small, even less than 0.001%. So even if it's the risk is consequence is very serious, doesn't mean you are going to add it in planning because the probability of that risk is very low. Similarly, a probability of risk is very high, 90% that is going to happen, but the consequence is very insignificant, highly insignificant. So you say, okay, that's not really worth planning for it. Make sense? So only because a probability is very high or the consequence is very serious is not just a reason to add them for planning. But naturally, those who have higher or moderate possibilities and serious or moderate consequences, of course, those are more important candidates you're going to plan for it. Of course, something which comes in the middle, and again, there's no exact science here, but something which comes here in the middle is naturally some ideas like the possibility is medium and the consequence is moderate. What do you do about them? These are gray areas. So one strategy to deal with them is to see how many risks you have already shortlisted. And if you have few risk and you still have some time and you can assume you have some budget to deal with risks, then you might include them. But if the list you have selected is already a big, relatively speaking, a large list, you might then not select those type of gray area risks. So it's subjective in that sense, right? So risk planning is this. Again, I hope this is clear. So we go now to the last part of risk management. Okay. And this is the idea of what we call, risk monitoring, right? So what's the idea of risk monitoring? The idea of risk monitoring is there are many aspects to it. One of the aspects is that once the risk happen, you have to initiate those these plans, right? The contingency plan and all those stuff. So risk monitoring continuously monitors the throughout the development of the project that what's going to happen, right? So we understand what we understand here is this. Let's say this is the life cycle or the lifespan of the project. Let's say this is the lifespan of the project. Let's say this project might be, for example, for 2 years. Now, what you did initially is all this risk management procedures. You identified the risk, you analyze the risk, you plan for the risk, and of course, these are the steps you do. But once you have done that, what you have to do is you have to do risk monitoring throughout your project, right or no? And what will it mean is that maybe some of the risks were high initially in the project, but after a few weeks, those risks became moderate or low. So you have to continuously update you have to continuously analyze your risk and update your plan. So for example, what will happen in terms of risk identification analysis, risk monitoring throughout the project, new risk might be added to the project. And similarly, old risk might be even removed from the project. So this risk keeps changing. That's important to keep in mind. Also, from the analysis point of view, you have to continuously re-evaluate the risk. So some risks were high, possibility now becomes moderate or low. Some have minor consequences, but now for some reason it became serious consequences. Or some were serious consequences, now it became moderate consequences. So you have to keep assessing it. So just take as an example, student, initially, one of the risks we identified in the project was student dropping the course. And we said maybe the possibility is low or moderate or low to moderate. But what happens after 4 or 5 weeks into the course? The possibility of student dropping the course generally increases or decreases? Think about it. It does increase or does decrease? Because what happens is mostly the students drop the course in the first 2-3 weeks once you don't have any permanent record, or once you can drop with grade W. But the later you have, the consequence for the students are more of dropping the course, right? One of the immediate consequence could be he gets a WP or WF grade. So that's something to think about. Next is that after a certain time, you have to drop all the courses. You cannot just drop one course. So of course, it's a heavy consequence for the student himself. So generally students, once they don't drop in the initial few weeks, generally they stick to the courses. So the idea, generally speaking, if you see, is that if the student didn't drop the course initially, then the risk of dropping a course becomes down. Generally speaking, it becomes low. So the point is, yeah, you have to continuously monitor there. So before you saw that there was a risk that the staff would leave the company. But then after a few weeks, you saw the situation in the market has changed drastically because of some other factors. Now the job market is not that good. So this possibility of many people leaving the company, now before it was moderate to high, now it became low. So things change. And because things change, you also update your plan, right? How you're going to deal with those risks, which I guess makes very common sense, right? So because the risk analysis give you a different result now, your planning has to be modified. And this process has to go throughout the project. You continuously monitor the project, you continuously reanalyze the project, you continuously update your risk plan.